Well, Peter Dutton has used his budget and reply speech to slam the government's new migration program, which would see more than 700,000 people move to Australia by the end of next year. You ready for that? The massive increase comes as Australians face a housing and rental crisis. And in typical fashion, Labor has given no indication of how Labor plans to handle this huge migration surge. Joining us now is the Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, Dan Tehan. Dan, great to see you as always. Wish we were there with you in that beautiful landscape you're in. It looks absolutely fantastic. Now tell us about what on earth are Labor up to? 700,000 people by the end of next year. Where are they going to live?
Well, they don't know where they're going to live and they have no plan to deal with this. And as James knows, and he's done some excellent reporting on this over the last couple of months, Labor are just making it up as they go along. We've been warning that this will have dire consequences for the housing crisis that the nation's facing. It'll have dire consequences for the rental crisis the nation is facing, that they have no plan to work with the Labor states and territories on the mainland, all of them Labor state governments, to address what will need to be done with congestion. As a matter of fact, the budget saw the government reduce funding for roads and rail, so it's going to make the congestion worse. And the Reserve Bank has been warning that this huge increase in migration is actually going to put upward pressure on inflation and lead to higher interest rates potentially. So all these things show that Labor absolutely have no plan to deal with this surge. And it's 715,000 this year and next year, but over this year and the next 4 years, it's 1.5 million in the budget papers. And the strange thing is that Jim Chalmers didn't mention that number in his budget speech. And Claire O'Neill, when 2 weeks ago she spoke on immigration at the National Press Club, did not mention these numbers. As a matter of fact, the only reason we found out about the 715,000 number, which they tried to keep quiet, was because one of the state premier's officers leaked the number out and then the Labor Party had to confess to it.
James.
And I'm glad you mentioned the RBA and inflation, all of that. Can you give us some suggestion of, given the rate of homes being built in this country and the rate of people who are expected to be coming into this country, how many dwellings we will fall short and what implications will that have? I mean, will we see housing sizes increase as people move back in with family or with each other? Will it be harder for the RBA to bring down interest rates if there is more competition for housing heating up that housing market, which is, of course, one of the things that the RBA tries to cool, along with just broader general inflation and the competition for goods?
Well, it's a really good question, James. And the budget papers actually showed that the historic number of dwellings that are going to be built over the next couple of years in this country is going to decline. That's in the government's own budget papers. Shane Oliver from the ANZ, their chief economist, has said we're going to need, on top of what is already forecast to be built, another 200,000 houses to be built. And as you know, what we've been seeing recently is actually building companies, sadly, going out of business. So this points to a dire picture of what we're going to be able to do to deal with these 1.5 million surge in population. And once again, the government has no plan. They had 9 years in opposition, and it's a really interesting point here. What did they do during that 9 years in opposition? Because I can tell you, Claire O'Neill, the first thing she did when she became Home Affairs Minister was commission 3 people to do a review of the immigration system. They had no policies, and the dire consequences of this are being seen now, because all we've seen is them seek to address a visa system by allowing more people to come in, 1.5 million people, with no plan to address congestion, housing, rents, you name it, the list goes on. And sadly, it's going to be the Australian people that suffer as a result.
Rita.
I want to ask you about Michaelia Cash's comments about the proposed race-based referendum, The Voice. She said it's going to destroy the equality of citizenship and embed racial division into the Constitution. Why did it take the Liberal Party so long to recognise what this proposal was and that it should have been rejected on principle, not waiting 10 months for details before taking a stand?
Well, it's a very good question, Rita. And we wanted to work with the government to try and get an outcome which there would be bipartisanship on it, so that we wouldn't see that division in the community that sadly we're going to see as a result of Labor's Voice referendum. And Michaelia is absolutely right on that point of principle. And if you go back in history, it's a point of principle which has always been there. It goes back to Aristotle, who was the first philosopher to seriously look at constitutions. And he said that the best constitution has to be one where there is equality before the law. And that's a principle which is held right through the ages and something we've sought and fought for. And now we seem to be going to turn all that on its head. Now, we wanted to see whether we could get some bipartisanship on it, but sadly Anthony Albanese has just sort of bulldozed ahead with his approach, and now we're going to get this very divisive debate and in the end this division that Anthony Albanese wants to put in our constitution.
Now, Dan, on that point, I speak to a lot of people and that they all Australians, it goes without saying, the majority, by far the majority of Australians have nothing but goodwill towards Indigenous Australians and want to have the best outcome for particularly Indigenous Australians in those remote communities, which have all sorts of problems that we know about. But the confusion is nobody really understands, or particularly what The Voice is about. But when you say to everyday Australians, well, there are Indigenous Australians like Jacinta Price, Warren Mundine, Anthony Dillon, any number of other Indigenous Australians who are against this, they get confused because they're not hearing the no case put forward as strongly as the yes case. Dan, what do you say to those corporations, all those individuals who are pushing the yes case but are ignoring the fact that the no case is supported by so many Indigenous Australians? What do you say to them?
Well, what we should always have in this country is the ability to have a very balanced debate, and we should be able to put both sides very strongly. And the great thing about referendums is it's the Australian people who get to make the final choice, but they should get access to all the information. And I know as I speak to people in my local community that what they're really concerned about is the fact that we're really putting the cart before the horse. We don't know how this is going to work. We don't know the detail of how it's going to work. We don't know how it's going to lead to those practical outcomes on the ground. And what we don't know in Western Victoria is who is going to represent us. That's not clear at all. So all those questions that need to be answered about how this would work in practice aren't being answered by the government. We're being told, trust us, trust the Labor Party, trust their voice model, and it'll be all right in the end. Now, I don't think the Australian people will buy that. I think they want to know the detail. They want to know how this will work and the practical outcomes. And they also, I think, once they hear from the two very, very good Indigenous leaders that we have in our party and others, that they have these serious concerns as well, I think they will begin to question Labor's voice model.
I can tell you how it's going to work. It's not. It's just going to be a permanent bureaucracy that's going to cost a lot of money and achieve very little. But just back on the population surge we're about to experience, we've talked about the housing crisis, roads, inflationary pressures, hospitals. Why aren't we talking more about the pressure on the health system? Because you speak to anybody in that sector, they say the waiting lists are terrible, the system's already in some sort of a crisis, and that massive number of people coming in is surely going to put pressure on the hospital system that perhaps it can't cope with.
It's a very good point, Rita, and one that I've raised previously, but yeah, you're absolutely right. Should have mentioned earlier, because especially if you go to northwest Melbourne or western Melbourne or into western Sydney, that's where we're really seeing that the demand on, especially on emergency departments, play out, and this will put increased pressure on our health system. And as we know, probably more than any other system it is the one that is suffering at the moment. I think here in Victoria, the biggest issue we're almost facing is what we do with our health system. And I think it's like that across the country. So it's a very good point. This is just going to exacerbate the demands and pressures being put on our health system.
Dan Tehan, I think you put your finger on it when you said the problem is with the voices that you're being asked to trust Labor. Anyone who's ever trusted Labor knows that that's the wrong way to be going. Absolutely. Dan Tehan, thanks so much for coming on Outsiders, and have a terrific Mother's Day wherever you will be today. Thanks so much, Dan.